The defining feature of planet Earth is its ocean, a blanket of water that surrounds the globe, connects it, and forms the core of our planetary life support system. And possibly the most iconic image of the best of our ocean is the coral reef, rich, varied, and endlessly fascinating. We hear a lot about them, but what we hear tends to fall mostly into one of only two categories. We hear that they are biologically amazing, that they are rich, varied habitats, home to thousands of creatures, and a constant reminder of how beautiful life in the ocean is. But the second message that we hear is that they're vulnerable, that ocean pollution, a warming world, lots of different stresses are damaging these critical habitats. So both of those are true for coral reefs now. But what about their future? Well, when we want to navigate around our world, to go for a walk or to drive across town, we use a map. So what about the idea of a map that could help us navigate to a better future for our coral reefs? Well, a huge team of scientists funded by the Bertarelli Foundation has been working on just that, and that is the topic of our event at the Royal Geographical Society today. I'll be talking to Dr. Gareth Williams from Bangor University about all of that. And these maps are open, they're available for everybody to use, scientists, businesses, policymakers, and they send some really strong messages about the decisions that we need to make now in order to navigate our way to a better future, both for coral reefs and for ourselves. So let's begin at the beginning and take a look at what these maps are and how they can help us. So Gareth, we're going to be talking about ocean temperature a lot. Why do we need to know about ocean temperature in the future?
Well, ocean temperatures affect so much on our planet. You know, our planet is, as you can see on this image, is largely covered with water, with ocean. And the ocean moves around heat around our planet and moisture. And in doing so, it drives the global climate system. So it affects, you know, where and when it rains and how much it rains. Ocean temperatures also govern where things can live. So different species have different responses to temperature. You can only find some species living with certain temperatures. And the ocean temperature also affects biological processes. It can affect things like how fast fish grow, for example. So when we're thinking about the ocean temperatures changing into the future, we're talking about possible changes to all those patterns and processes. And it becomes really hard for us to think about planning for those changes if we don't know what they are.
And we're going to be talking specifically about the relationship between temperature and coral. So tell us a little bit about a coral to start us off, and then why temperature is such a critical parameter for them.
Well, corals are one of those organisms that are sensitive to fluctuations in temperature. They live within a very narrow temperature band. They're very sensitive to it. And if temperatures go above a certain level, what happens is a process called coral bleaching. Now, coral bleaching is where the little microscopic algae that live inside the corals, they are photosynthesizing and providing corals with energy from sunlight. And in return, the corals provide the algae with a home to live and protection. So that mutually beneficial relationship is known as a symbiosis. Now, extreme temperatures cause a breakdown in that symbiosis. It's still unclear to scientists who's the weaker link, the coral or the algae, but the algae leave the coral or they're removed from the coral. And at the point, the corals have lost a large amount of their food that's coming in via that sunlight, and so they can effectively starve to death at that point and suffer mortality.
So the issue we've got is that in a warming world, if corals are very sensitive to temperature, potentially there's a lot of damage that can be done here. Right,
those coral bleaching events will become more severe and they'll become more frequent as those temperatures rapidly rise, absolutely.
And what is the link, you know, of course, it hurts to think of losing beautiful, rich, biodiverse areas. But it's not just about the animals, is it? There is the fate of the coral reefs also affects people. Absolutely.
And, you know, we hear so much about, you know, the biodiversity of coral reefs, which is very important, you know, in terms of having species diversity on our planet. But, you know, maybe not ourselves on a daily basis, but some people rely on coral reefs every day for very important things like nutrition. And so there are people on our planet who are getting 100% of their protein from fish that live on coral reefs. They're getting micronutrients such as zinc and calcium, things that can protect against childhood diseases and things like that, things that are vital for development and growth. And so those people are very closely tied to coral reefs, and with the potential loss of those coral reefs, we see the loss of those benefits to people. And, you know, and of course we could see people eventually starving to death, just like the corals do.
And you've been working with lots of colleagues on a project to map the future of ocean temperatures. So what's the big picture of how maps of the future could help us?
Well, maps of the future, if you think about a journey, how do you get to a certain point when you're making decisions? You need a map to get you there. And so we've kind of thought about climate scenarios in that same way. If we were to change our actions as a planet, where does it take us in terms of ocean warming, and how might that affect coral reefs across our planet?
Now, you've been looking at the Indian Ocean specifically, so why is that region such a critical one to look at?
The Indian Ocean is fascinating from the point of view that many of the coral reefs that are found in the Indian Ocean, which any of these coloured pixels is where there are coral reefs present, there are also a lot of people. Across many of these parts, there are large human populations that are getting all those benefits from the reefs that I mentioned before.
So we should have clarified a point before, which is that corals can bleach and recover from it, but if the bleaching becomes a regular event,
absolutely,
then they can't recover anymore.
Yeah, so corals can actually bleach and survive. They can regain their algae and start to photosynthesize again. But they can suffer mortality if those bleaching events either go on for very long or they become so frequent that there's no time for recovery in between in terms of the reef growing back, yes.
So what we're looking at on the map here, so explain the colours to me.
So the colours are ranging from 2030 in this case to 2090, and what we're showing is where each reef location, at what point in time we think that particular reef pixel, in this case a 27-kilometre sized pixel, when will that start to bleach every year from that point onwards, at which point there's zero chance for recovery. This is a sort of, we're mapping a worst case scenario here.
And so the idea here is that the later the annual bleaching, the more time there is to adapt and for us to do things. So basically, red on this map is bad because it means bad things are going to happen too soon.
Exactly, and as you can see just from a glance here, there's a lot of red and orange on this map, which basically means that everything is coming very soon, if not already, for some reef locations that they're experiencing very, very frequent bleaching events. Yeah.
Now maps like this have existed before, but you've done some recent work which has improved the resolution. So just tell me why. And when we say resolution, we mean basically how small the individual boxes are that you can look at. Yeah. So tell me about the difference that the resolution makes.
Well, the resolution, for a big picture like this, if you just cared about patterns across the whole of the Indian Ocean, you can see this is actually quite informative. But, thinking about people who are on the ground making decisions about sections of coastline or around small islands just offshore, a 27-kilometre resolution is going to be a box that covers most of that island, perhaps. And so it doesn't really give any information about how, for spatial planning. So, for example, here we're looking at the northern coast of Madagascar, and at this coarse resolution, you can see there's some variation that we could work with there. But say I was interested in deciding some actions for marine spatial planning around one of these offshore islands, you can see that the box simply covers the island. It doesn't really give us much information.
So we should be clear here that the white is the land and the dark bits are the ocean.
Correct.
And all those boxes, like within that box, each box is all the same colour.
Yes,
so that's
exactly.
all the detail you get for that box.
So each box just gets the same year. So for one of the, most of this is around the sort of 2030 to 2035 kind of mark, yeah. But it lacks that resolution to make informed decisions about how to, for example, section up a coastline to protect coral reefs. And
so describe then the work you've been doing to improve the resolution here.
Well, we take these coarse resolutions and we use some statistics basically to downscale them, make them smaller. And the way we do that is we take models of the ocean temperature. We talked about those gradients of temperature before. There are high-resolution models of temperature across our planet. We basically take those complex global climate change models and we relaunch them at these smaller scales. And what we do is we give them locally relevant starting points, therefore, to launch those projections. So what we get then is a much clearer, sort of, in terms of spatial scale, we get a finer resolution projection of what we think those temperatures are doing. And you can see now that for some of these offshore islands, rather than it just being covered in one pixel, which isn't particularly informative if you're trying to make within-island decisions, now we can actually see some variations such that one half of the island might experience annual severe bleaching before the other side, and that could be really informative for decision making.
Because that's perhaps quite counterintuitive, isn't it? Because you would think that, an ocean is a big thing. If it's getting warmer, you would think lots of it would get warmer, and so surely all the coral is going to suffer at the same rate. But what you're actually showing us on these maps is that even quite close together, there are squares that are almost next to each other here.
Absolutely.
And one of them is almost the worst case, and one of them is the best case. They're very different.
Well, and being driven by all kinds of things that the gradients in ocean temperature can be affected by physical processes like upwelling. So there could be upwelling on one side of an island versus another, which cools that side of the island. So you see these different gradients in temperature on very small scales, and that's what we're trying to capture here. We're trying to make these coarse climate change models more locally relevant.
And let's just discuss where this information comes from. So what we call a climate model is it's basically a flight simulator for a planet. So there's a huge amount. We're sort of running a simulation of the global engine.
These are based on the new generation of climate models that were very recently released just this year. And those models are what we call ensemble models. They're not just one person's idea of what the planet might do in terms of warming. There's a lot of very clever people who have been working on different ways to model how temperatures might rise across our planet. And so there's upwards of 20 of these models that are all kind of combined. We take those models and then, like I said, we relaunch them and use them at these locally relevant scales. But they are the averages of all those different complexities that have gone into this.
So in northern Madagascar, that's just one example, but you've got some others to show us as well.
Yeah, we've driven these higher resolution data across all of the Indian Ocean. And so, for example, here we're looking at part of the Maldives archipelago on the left, and then the southern coast of India going towards Sri Lanka there, as you can see. And again, this is at that 5-kilometer downscaled resolution to help inform local management.
So this is really detailed. The thing that's impressive about this is that it is, if you were someone who was living on that coastline, this is exactly what you want to know. You can actually do something with this information because it affects you. You can see you can deal with your local area.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, absolutely. And so that's exactly what we're trying to do. So many global climate change models are at a resolution that is useful at sort of ocean basin scales, but when we're thinking about people making decisions along small parts of their island or coastline, you can't plan for change, as I mentioned before, without information at that kind of scale. Yeah.
So it's one thing to look at the future path that we are currently on, but as we know, there are many discussions because we do not want to be on this path for many, many reasons. So how can your maps help us with looking at alternative futures?
Well, the maps, as you can see right now, they highlight what will happen, as I mentioned before, if we carry on doing what we've been doing. And although there's some variation across this picture you see right now, it still paints a very red and orange kind of picture, very close into the future that coral reefs will suffer immense mortality. But we have an option to change what we do on our planet. That's the important thing here. I think the maps also highlight there's an opportunity to do something. All is not lost for coral reefs, and so we could make some significant changes to the amount of fossil fuels we consume, for example. We could get ourselves onto a different path for global warming. For example, if we adhere to all those pledges made under the Paris Agreement, what we've done here is we've tried to simulate what would the alternative future of coral reefs look like. Now, this is actually a bit more optimistic than the Paris Agreement. We're talking here about meeting about 150% of those pledges. But all of a sudden, we start to move that color ramp towards the right. You can see here along the southern coast of India, we've got some places that still remain, reaching those annual severe bleaching points very close in the future. But we've got some pixels now turning those kind of blue colors, which is pushing that threshold more towards the end of the century. Particularly as you can see here, if we zoom in, we can see now that resolution coming through. So as we go from the west coast of southern India here, which again is sort of 2030s, 2040s, we move through the southern coast of India towards the Gulf of Mannar. That's that little dip on the right. And we start to see bleaching thresholds not meeting those annual severe bleaching points until, 2080, 2085.
So the point here is that there is a very direct relationship between the emissions scenario that we choose and how long and how well our coral reefs are going to, the conditions for coral reefs.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, corals will continue to get warm, oceans will continue to get warm as the ocean warms into the future. But we're buying more time for corals. Right? By cutting down greenhouse gas emissions and slowing that rate of ocean warming, we're giving them more time to adjust to these increasing temperatures. It doesn't do away with the problem, but it buys more time for nature.
And what about the corals themselves? So, we're talking here just about temperature, so that's just one of the many things that corals can be stressed or damaged by, but it's a very important one. You have to know something about the coral to know when it's likely to bleach.
That's right, and it's a very important point you're touching on here. What we're modelling here is the exposure to that temperature. We're not modelling how the reefs might react. So to put it into some recent context, thinking about the COVID pandemic, we're modelling here, who in the human population is going to be exposed to that virus. We're not modelling what happens then. Some people get very sick, as we know, and end up in hospital. Others don't. And it's the same with coral reefs. And reefs react differently to that ocean stress. We are not accounting for that local resilience that might be inherent to some of these reef areas. We're purely modelling the exposure part of that thermal change.
So the point here is that this is just part of the story, that then coral, it may be that some species of coral might survive a little bit better. So this is kind of the headline risk. Mm-hmm. But then it may be that nature, corals might adapt if we give them enough time.
Absolutely.
To change.
Well, think about even today on our planet. At any point in time we see, a large gradient in temperature across our planet. Take the Red Sea. It's very much warmer than, say, parts of the Central Pacific where our team works, considerably warmer. And yet there are still corals living in both of those locations. Corals have adapted over geological time to those increased temperatures in the Red Sea. They've adapted to those increased temperatures. So we see that anyway on our planet right now. It can also happen over time. I'm not talking about a single coral within its lifetime becoming more thermally resistant. But of course, through selective mortality, when there are bleaching events, some corals die and some corals don't die. And those that don't die are potentially more resistant to those increased temperatures. They breed, and those populations then perhaps have genes that make them more resilient to those increased temperatures. And so through that selective mortality, the coral populations themselves might actually adapt to these increasing temperatures. But again, if we can buy them time for natural selection to work.
So there's kind of two things going on here, that the further our actions can push these squares into the blue, the more time there is both for humans to adapt, but also for the corals themselves to adapt.
Exactly.
It's good all round.
Yeah, exactly. And I guess if, it's the idea of that if we can do our bit, perhaps nature can do its bit as well and adapt in time. But again, we just need to buy them that time for that to happen. I don't think we should rely on it. We need to be very aggressive with our emissions cuts. But we're seeing evidence already in the literature that corals are in fact undergoing increased thermal tolerance in some geographies through that process of natural selection I mentioned before.
So these, your team has put a lot of effort into creating these maps, and now I guess you would like other people to look at these maps. So what specific things could other people do with this kind of resolution? Who might look at them?
I think a variety of people could look at them. I mean, policymakers for sure, it paints a very clear picture of what happens if we don't do anything. And I think therefore it gives no excuses to not do anything. We have a chance to make a difference, and that's the key take-home message here, I would say. If all was lost, then we just carry on as normal, right? But all is not lost. We have a chance to steer ourselves to a different future for coral reefs, and that's very important, I think, in terms of speaking to policymakers. At another scale, though, at a much more local scale, as I mentioned before, people who are having to make decisions every day about how to manage their reef resources, they can use information like this to start thinking about, strategically, which areas do I need to place more effort to protect, to try to increase perhaps that local resilience to climate change.
And so, what about who gets access to the maps? I mean, is it something that anyone can have a look at? How does that work?
Yeah, our team works really hard to make sure that all have access. So it's not some big complex model that can only be accessed using a certain computer. We are effectively producing maps like this that can be, even emailed to people at very low resolution, so that if you're on an internet connection in the middle of Fiji, you should still be able to download a map that I send you and be able to look at that. And that's really important, because remember, a lot of people who live on coral reefs and are making decisions live in areas where internet might not be that great. So we're trying to produce these summary graphics. They're available as images, or they're available as much more complex computer files that you can dig into the data in more detail.
And what's the thing that you've obviously been working on this and thinking about this for a long time? What's the thing that excites you most about the point you've got to now? What's the coolest thing about these maps? I
think the coolest thing is that we finally have an idea of the natural variation that exists in how warm our ocean will get in the coming decades. And that, like you mentioned before, this idea that everything just gets hot. Well, it does to some degree, but there are many feedbacks, as you can see here, that are driving local variation. And to me, it's actually more staggering than I'd initially anticipated. And so that's reassuring. I think that local variation is really a big finding within the data that excites me. It excites me that not all hope is lost immediately. But it also excites me that it shows that we should do something, that we're not out of time yet. But we need to act now, we need to act fast.
And who has been, because I know some people have already been using these maps. Who's already been using them?
People we've worked with in Hawaii, for example. So Hawaii is undergoing a very important process at the moment called the 30 by 30, where they're trying to protect 30% of the marine areas by 2030. And so they're making decisions about which areas around Hawaii they should protect and how. And so our maps are helping to inform them, at least on that exposure part of that climate stress that's coming, and allowing them to make more informed decisions about, for example, coral outplanting, or areas where they think that social resilience from people could be under a threat. Yeah.
How about the response of the corals themselves?
Yeah, so if we transition, for example, to the coast of Kenya and up towards Tanzania, I mean, what we're showing here is that grim picture of if we don't change our actions on the planet and that worst case scenario. We've talked then about shifting onto that separate emissions scenario where we cut aggressively greenhouse gas emissions. And as you can see here, we suddenly move towards the right on that color ramp, and we start moving into a more optimistic outlook. But corals, of course, can also adapt to temperature if they're given enough time. And that's why it's so important that we give them that time to adapt. So when temperature stress occurs and they bleach, some corals die and some don't die. And those that don't die have baby corals that perhaps are more resistant to those thermal stress events. And what we've modeled here is assuming that if corals along the coastline of Kenya and Tanzania became 1 degree more thermally tolerant. If it took 1 degree Celsius more before they went over that coral bleaching threshold, what does the outlook suddenly look like? And then we've moved on our color ramp, in some cases off the end of this scale. So those pixels that are white-gray, that's beyond the end of the century before they're reaching that point of annual severe bleaching. So I guess what this tells us in terms of the results is that if we do our bit and we cut greenhouse gas emissions and buy coral reefs time, if they could almost do their little bit and gain that extra little bit of adaptation, we suddenly move into a much more optimistic scenario.
So if we do our bit and then we're a bit lucky with nature, actually we can definitely avoid the worst, and we can actually think about healthy corals that will survive into the future.
Absolutely. I mean, to steal a line from Jeff Goldblum, life finds a way, right? And if we give it enough time, maybe it will find a way. I don't think we should rely on it, but it would be an added bonus, as you said.
And now we're going to hear from someone who's actually been making use of these maps on the ground, and that is Kim Hum, who is the Marine Program Director of the Nature Conservancy in Hawaii.
Aloha, my name is Kim Hum, and I'm the Marine Program Director for the Nature Conservancy's Hawaii chapter. I'm honored to speak with you today about our work in Hawaii blending the latest science and traditional management to achieve more climate-resilient, natural, and local communities. First, a little bit about us. The Nature Conservancy is a science-based global nonprofit focused on conserving the lands and waters on which all life depends. We work in more than 70 countries and territories and in all 50 United States. Here in Hawaii, we are focused on the nearshore waters of the main Hawaiian Islands, where we are working to address the primary threats to our reefs, including overfishing, land-based pollutants, primarily sediments and nutrients, and climate impacts, including coral bleaching, storm damage, and coastal erosion. Our vision is healthy, resilient reefs supporting vibrant and thriving coastal fisheries and communities across the islands. Our goal is to increase the pace and scale of conservation to build coastal reef and community resilience. And our strategies are to blend the latest science with traditional management for effective reef conservation. I want to emphasize up front how critical it is that the science we conduct be grounded in and informed by local knowledge and traditional practices. The strength and success of our program is completely dependent on the engagement of community partners and the relationships we have built over the past 20 years. Conservation in Hawaii and across island and local cultures moves at the pace of trust, and trust takes time to build. Without trust, the science we conduct doesn't really matter because it won't be successful if communities don't understand or accept it. Now, the remainder of this presentation, I'll focus on how we're using the latest climate science to inform 3 projects that we are partnering on with the State of Hawaii Division of Aquatic Resources, or DAR. First is their Holomua 30 by 30 initiative, which is focused on effective management of 30% of nearshore waters by 2030. For coral restoration, we've just worked with the state and our partners at NOAA to complete a statewide coral restoration plan. Coral restoration is relatively new in the islands. That plan is focused on enhancing the resilience of reefs impacted by bleaching. The third project that we're working on together is an herbivore management project designed to sustainably manage herbivorous fish populations to increase reef resilience and ensure sustainable fisheries for local communities. So the state's Holomua initiative is largely focused on spatial management. Our team began supporting that goal by working with individual communities, helping them establish local marine managed areas and conducting monitoring to measure change over time. The graph in the middle of this slide shows the dramatic increase in biomass after the establishment of a community-based marine managed area in 2016. In order to get to 30% of areas managed by 2030, though, we needed to scale up our work to include regional reef resilience assessments, which we started in 2015 on the island of Maui, shown on the left, and Hawaii Island here on the right. This information is helping the state identify areas to focus their efforts on for the development of regional management areas. With the work of Gareth Williams, Jeff Maynard, and their teams, we were able to expand from assessing regional resilience indicators to modeling statewide resilience, which includes the biological and physical characteristics of the reef itself, for example, coral cover, coral recruitment, algal biomass, etc., and combine that with local stressors or human impacts like fishing pressure, cesspools, golf courses, seawalls, etc., and then add in the climate component. How hot is it going to get, for how long, by when? This combination of resilience, human impacts, and downscaled global climate models gives us a measure of vulnerability for areas across the state. So how are we using that information? For the 30 by 30 initiative, this new information enables us to now assess vulnerability and prioritize management at a statewide level. Vulnerability information is provided at both the statewide or inter-island level and at the island or intra-island level, allowing the state to identify areas they want to include in statewide and island-wide MMA networks. Now, where we can, we want to be working in areas with low vulnerability, shown in green and yellow in these maps. But resilient MMA design requires replication and representation, which may include areas of higher vulnerability, shown in orange and red. In addition, 30 by 30 is a community-based process, and we want to work in biologically important areas where communities are engaged and leading management efforts. So for example, one of those areas is the west coast of Hawai'i Island, here on the right, where we are working with more than 20 communities along the coast to improve nearshore management. While this area appears highly vulnerable, remember that vulnerability includes human impacts as well as climate impacts and biological characteristics. So in some cases, we may be able to reduce vulnerability by addressing local stressors. We'll just need to identify specific strategies to address what makes these areas more vulnerable. Before we move to intra-island vulnerability, I'd like you to take a look at the island of Oahu in the middle top of this slide, where you'll notice a lot of red and orange areas, especially along the southeast shore. This is largely due to the fact that Oahu is the most populated island in the state and includes the main metropolitan area of Honolulu and global tourist destination of Waikiki. Now, if you look at Oahu on this slide of intra-island vulnerability, you'll see that there are areas that are more or less vulnerable than other areas on Oahu. You'll see the same pattern on the west coast of Hawai'i Island. This is important because the 30 by 30 goal is both statewide and island-wide, meaning we want to include 30% of areas in networks on all islands to ensure representation and replication across the state. This new information on intra-island vulnerability allows us to do that. As I mentioned earlier, the state has just completed a coral restoration plan focused on enhancing reefs impacted by bleaching. In that plan, we have identified 5 priority areas for pilot restoration projects. The process for identifying those areas integrated future climate vulnerability, resilience, and human impacts to help us get from over 200 possible restoration sites down to the 12 sites you see on this table. The resilience factors are in the left-hand section of the table, and the colored sections on the right are derived from local knowledge about each of the sites. We then use this information to go from 12 to 5 priority restoration areas. The climate models also enabled us to identify which of the 5 areas we would prioritize for restoration. So on the left, you see one of the priority areas with lower vulnerability at Kaho'olaehu. On the right is Waikiki, the priority area with the highest vulnerability. I know you can't read all of these maps, but you can definitely see the difference in the color scales, with much more red and orange in Waikiki on the right. So using this information, we have decided to start our first pilot restoration project at Kaho'olaehu. This work has other applications as well. So while developing the restoration plan, the state was also looking for information they could use to help evaluate restoration permits. It was fairly easy to take the vulnerability information and use it to help set guidelines for permitting applications. In this case, the state may suggest applicants avoid restoration in areas of high vulnerability, shown in red on these maps, or decide not to approve permits for these areas at all. This isn't something that was on our radar when we started this project, but because this is a robust approach, it has many different applications. One of those possible applications may be in helping to identify areas that could be candidates for reef insurance, which is a relatively new tool for securing funds to repair reefs after a natural disaster, such as a hurricane. This map overlays vulnerability on sites with medium to high levels of coastal infrastructure that is being protected by coral reefs. This can help us identify where we may want to prioritize reef insurance, for example, in those areas shown in red and orange on this map. It may also help to set variable costs for insurance, with insurance in green areas potentially being more affordable because the reefs are less vulnerable. Lastly, we are assessing the application of climate vulnerability to the state's herbivore management initiative. This map shows a conceptual framework that overlays vulnerability with a decline in herbivore biomass to identify areas where the state may want to consider prioritizing herbivore protection, for example, on the northeast coast of Hawai'i Island, Molokai, or Oahu, or the leeward coast of Maui or Ni'ihau. I hope this short presentation has given you a clear overview of how we are using the latest climate models to improve planning and management across the Hawaiian Islands, and how this information may be able to inform your efforts. Please feel free to contact me at khum@tnc.org if you have any questions. Mahalo nui loa to our many partners on these projects, and especially to Gareth Williams and Jeff Maynard, and to the Bertarelli Foundation for the opportunity to speak with you today. Aloha.
It's so exciting to hear about these maps already being used on the ground, but it gets even better because they have even more potential. So let's look at some of the other uses, like beyond corals. What are your favourite applications?
Yeah, I mean, corals aren't the only things that live on coral reefs. There are other organisms as well that utilize coral reefs. Turtles, for example, utilize coral reefs. And these kind of information can be very informative for thinking about turtles and how turtles are going to develop in the future.
And turtles are interesting, aren't they? Well, obviously turtles are interesting. They're amazing creatures. But the temperature affects what kind of turtle grows in quite an interesting way.
No, it's fascinating. So the nest temperature, when a turtle lays eggs, the nest temperature determines what sex the offspring will be. Higher temperatures tend to lead to more females. So as the ocean warms, the air warms, and in turn the sand can warm, and what we're seeing are higher proportions of those baby turtles becoming female. And of course that can interfere with the reproductive potential of those populations over time. So these data can be used through some basic mathematics to link the ocean back to the sand. Could be used to also inform on how those sand temperatures might change in the future as well.
And that's important because it helps conservation efforts.
That's right, yeah, well at least it helps us to plan again. It's that planning for change. At what point will certain turtle populations in certain parts of our planet start going over some thresholds in terms of how many females are being born relative to males and how that will impact their populations into the future.
And turtles laying eggs, that's obviously still at the coast. Everything we've looked at so far has been at the coast, but these models work in the open ocean as well.
That's right, yeah. I mean, the maps we've been showing, we've trimmed those just to show you where coral reefs, coastal coral reefs are, but we can model sea surface temperatures in between those sections as well. So we actually have data across the entirety of the surface of the Indian Ocean. And that can be really important for thinking about impacting other creatures that live in the open ocean. For example, little bits of food, plankton that grows in the open ocean is very sensitive to temperature, and increasing warming ocean will affect the growth of that food and in turn affect fisheries that live in the open ocean as well.
And so again, it's a way of helping us choose our own actions to minimise the impact on the environment.
That's right, and telling us where fisheries will be impacted first maybe as well, and us needing to think about reallocating effort potentially in order to provide some buffer to those fisheries in particular that are going to suffer the hardest, the quickest.
So you've opened a lot of amazing doors for us here that we can use maps like these to look into the future, slightly fuzzy crystal ball, but still useful information, and we can change our decisions. What are the big messages you have about all of this? What do you want everyone to know about this kind of technology?
Well, I guess in the case of coral reefs, I think it highlights that it's absolutely worth us doing something. There are tens of billions, maybe hundreds of billions of individual corals still alive on our planet, and it's worth saving them, okay? There are as many corals alive now as there are trees left in the Amazon. Potentially more. And so if we can shift our planet onto those climate pledges and meet those emissions targets and buy coral reefs more time, we can save those corals that still exist for future generations and all the services they provide to humanity.
So the message here is that even though we can see, we hear grim stories, actually we have optimism because we have knowledge, but we have to use it.
We have to use it. And I think actually more than ever, there's a voice out there, I would say, at the moment calling for change, perhaps more so than ever. And I think I'm encouraged by that. I don't think people are going to let governments get away anymore without meeting climate pledges. And that's exciting to me, at least for the first time. I feel like there could actually be action, and action to help steer coral reefs back towards the future they deserve.
Right now, world leaders are gathering in Glasgow to deliver on the promises made in Paris. And now we're going to hear from Ambassador Peter Thompson, who's the UN Secretary-General's Special Envoy for the Ocean, who's going to remind us of the scale of the challenge that humanity faces and how critical it is that we get this right.
Ladies and gentlemen, as I speak, we're on the eve of the important Global Climate Change Conference. The UNFCCC's COP26 being held in Glasgow. COP26 has been described by the President-designate as the last best hope to keep 1.5 alive. What is meant by that? 1.5 refers to the level of degrees Celsius by which the Earth's atmosphere has risen since the onset of the industrial age. Why is that a critical number? Because the IPCC, the collection of our best Earth scientists who are assembled to agree on our state of knowledge of climate change, published a report this year that caused the UN Secretary General to issue a red alert for humanity. The IPCC reported that unless there are immediate, rapid and large-scale reductions in our greenhouse gas emissions, quote, limiting warming to 1.5 degrees is out of reach. Meanwhile, the World Meteorological Organization released a report this year informing us that we're on track for global warming of over 3 degrees, unless major changes are made to the way we produce and consume. Earlier, the IPCC had made it clear with very high confidence that 70 to 90% of tropical corals that exist today will disappear, even if global warming is constrained to 1.5 degrees. Lastly in this litany, please appreciate that more than 90% of the excess heat trapped in the Earth system due to human-caused global warming has been absorbed by the long-suffering ocean. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time to change our ways or suffer the bitter consequences. To those who think all this attention on coral is not their concern, I say think again. We cannot live on a healthy planet without a healthy ocean. And we know that the ocean's health is currently in decline. Why do we need a healthy ocean? Well, only think of the fact that 50% of the planet's oxygen is produced in the ocean, and then consider your own situation if that oxygen production were no longer possible at that scale. I invite you to think of the fact that one tiny marine creature, Prochlorococcus, the world's smallest photosynthetic organism, produces 20% of the biosphere's oxygen. I suggest to you that the health of Prochlorococcus is closely linked to your well-being, and that you should think more about its well-being. We're all connected. And then, can we have a healthy ocean if and when coral has been eradicated from it? Honest answer, we don't know yet. But in my opinion, with coral reefs being home to 30% of the ocean's biodiversity, I don't see how that could be possible. And so, even as we struggle to persuade the bulk of humanity and the leaders who represent them of the urgent need for curtailment of our greenhouse gas emissions, in our own best interest, we must work on ways to save coral. I thus applaud all those working in the field to create the solutions required, including the work of Dr. Gareth Williams, Bangor University, and the Bertarelli Foundation, to build climate models which predict when coral bleaching may occur. This work confirms that nature has a prime role to play through ecological adaptation, and that given a fighting chance, corals can become more resilient to a warming ocean. Advancing marine science is vital to reversing the decline in which the ocean's health has been caught. And that is why the United Nations has designated the next 10 years as the UN Decade of Ocean Science. It's astounding to consider that on a planet whose surface is 70% covered by the ocean, that around 80% of the ocean's properties are not yet known to science. I'm delighted the Bertarelli Foundation's Indian Ocean Marine Science Program was one of the first to be endorsed as a UN Ocean Decade action. Ladies and gentlemen, nature cannot perform its role to coral's advantage if we continue to escalate our war against nature with the marine pollution of the plastic plague, the excess runoff from our industrial, agricultural, and sewage systems, our widespread practices of biodiversity and habitat destruction, and our wanton pumping of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And so, we have much work to do in Glasgow and in the aftermath of COP26, including at the Biodiversity COP15 in China next April, and the UN Ocean Conference in Portugal next June. The challenge to humanity to save the planet's coral is at the heart of our struggle to provide for the future of human security. In that regard, intergenerational justice demands the very best of us all. I thank you for your attention to my words.
One of the benefits of having really good climate models is that they act like a flight simulator for our planet. And that means that we can make our mistakes in the virtual world instead of the real world. So this mapping project is really important for connecting our behaviour today with the world of the future. And we can see that if we carry on this fossil-fueled path, the consequences for coral reefs, many of the coral reefs around the world, will be catastrophic. But we're not committed to that path. We can choose a different direction. We can choose a new future. Eliminating our reliance on fossil fuels is absolutely possible, but we do need to act now using the best knowledge that we have available. And if we do our part, then we're giving nature the chance, the time to play its part too. Now, Gareth and I are going to be joined by Dr. David Obora from Cordio, East Africa. He's in the UK at the moment for the COP26 summit. And this is your opportunity to ask questions about the future of reefs in a warming world. Hello to everyone who is joining us live. David and Gareth are now with us. And just before we get going on all the questions that I'm sure you've got, Gareth asked me to emphasise an important point, which is that, of course, a big project like this is all about a team effort. And he'd like to acknowledge the contribution of three others who have been instrumental in driving the project forward. And those are Ruben van Hooydonk and Jameson Gove from NOAA and Jeffrey Maynard from Symbiosis. So it is now time for questions. If you've got a question, you should be able to see a chat box either at the bottom or possibly to the right of your screen. So please put your questions in there. If you see lots and lots of questions, put your question in anyway, because we will be, any leftover questions we'll answer online afterwards. So put your question there and it will get an answer, even if it's not in the live session. But of course, we'll get through as many as we can. So we're looking for questions rather than comments. So do keep your questions short. That makes our life much easier. So let's get started on the questions that we've got now. So we will start with a question from George. Perhaps this is one for David. Is there anything that can be done to slow down coral bleaching as the temperatures remain high in the ocean?
Well, thanks. Good afternoon, good morning to everyone, wherever you are. So can anything be done to slow down the impact on corals? It's very hard. We have to reduce CO2 emissions, of course, take out the pressure as far as we can. I think Gareth has explained that really well. But there is a lot of research going into how to strengthen coral resistance, and that's whether through looking for and selecting resistant corals for transplantation, breeding, or trying to accelerate some of their adaptive capacities through experimental stress and so on. There's a lot of innovative research happening, but how far we can go with that is still an open question.
Thank you. And we should say to the audience that the reason for the background noise that we can hear just behind David is that he's actually at COP26 and in the thick of it all. And so there is a little bit of background noise, but that's just to help you feel part of the action. We've got a question here for Gareth from April, and the question is that if MSP decisions, so planning decisions, were based on the previous lower resolution model, you showed us that there was a lower resolution model and now there's a better one. So if decisions were made based on that lower resolution model, do you recommend a reassessment? Has anything changed in the big picture when it comes to the resolution change?
I do think it's worth a reassessment, yes. The improvement in the resolution, it translates to how much confidence we have in our models, really, I would say. So with the improvement of the new generation of climate models, they're much higher frequency in terms of how quickly they're recording temperatures, and therefore we end up with daily projections rather than monthly projections, which we had previously. So in answer to the April question, yeah, I would absolutely recommend. I don't think you need to start from scratch, and we can help discuss that with you, but I do think it's absolutely worth looking at the data again, especially if a big decision is being made about a particular area. Yes, indeed.
Brilliant, thanks. Don't keep putting questions in the chat. I know there's a few there, but do keep them coming. So another question for David. Obviously, you have done a huge amount of work in East Africa, and what do you think the most effective ways are to bring new research like this into the hands of managers and the communities who are really using it on the ground?
Well, so that is a big challenge, bringing this research to where it can be used, because in the past, we haven't had information on this scale, either the high resolution or the projection into the future of pressures like temperature and so on. And getting managers to think through these is a big challenge. I think one of the main ways is to use these scenarios to illustrate the range of options that there might be, how the different futures may unroll, and then to ask questions. What are their priorities? What are the policy frameworks that are active that they can actually make decisions in? And to then identify, well, how do we actually, tweak the models and the outputs to really inform that decision-making process? So there's a lot of back and forth that has to be done. And I think having some really good communication outputs to start that discussion is a critical next step, and these sorts of videos and webinars are a great way to do that.
It is. Communication is a huge part of this, isn't it? And especially when you think about how many people need to be involved in some of these decisions. But we are, I think, getting better at it, and the online world certainly helps. So you've got another question for Gareth. Well, so to follow on from that, if someone is interested in looking at this information and using it in their area, how do they actually get hold of the maps, and how much technical information do you need to interpret them? Because that's always a problem, that you potentially have quite complicated science, and you can't really send that out to people without helping them along a bit with what it means. So how do people get it, and how easy is it to use?
Oh, good question. I mean, we as a research group, we prefer to work with people from the beginning. We're not we don't like to just sort of produce science and then send it to people necessarily, but in some cases that's the only way to do it. But all these questions and these maps have generally been developed alongside our manager partners. So I just wanted to state that. But in terms of how to use them, I mean, we mentioned this in our discussions, Helen. For some aspects of this, I guess you don't need a huge level of understanding of what's going on behind the scenes if you trust that we've done things correctly, of course. In the same way that perhaps you only need to understand parts of a car to drive it, you don't need to understand how to swap out the carburetor, for example. So we can send the summary maps to people, indicating the patterns we were just discussing in our chat. And really all you need to understand about those are thresholds in temperature for bleaching, and we would provide that information to go alongside the maps. If you're interested though in digging in a lot deeper and thinking about using those data to answer other research questions, we talked there about turtle nest temperatures, then again we can supply those data in a much more detailed format, and are happy to work with researchers to help them to understand those. In the first instance is to contact us at the moment. We don't have an open source online platform just yet for these new high resolution data, but we're working towards that.
And to follow on from that, I'm going to put you on the spot for a question from Lovell. And that question is, what's going on in the Philippines? So with regard to the protection of corals, what's this study showing in the area of the Philippines? Do you know off the top of your head, or do we have to go and look at the maps?
Well, the high resolution, some of those high resolution data won't necessarily exist for the Philippines. We certainly have the model resolution data, so the 27-kilometer resolution data for the Philippines, and that was published as part of a UNET report actually last year, and that's an open access report. I can't type the link in off the top of my head, but I'm happy to chat to Lovell afterwards and provide her with a link to that free document that will have summary tables and summary maps for all parts of the Philippines.
Brilliant, thank you. Now, David, here's one for you, and you touched on this before, but it'd be great to hear a little bit more detail. It's a question from Alejandro, and the question is, can we identify, or have we identified, species of coral that can be resistant to climate change? Are there actually species out there that we already know can manage this?
Yes, actually, we're quite well aware now that the vulnerability or susceptibility of different coral species to high temperatures is quite different. There are species that are very vulnerable and bleach and die very quickly. There are those that survive through those bleaching events. So what's happening right now through all these global bleaching events is that actually natural selection is doing its work. We had a major bleaching event in the West Indian Ocean, East Africa in 1998, at similar, even higher temperatures in 2016, but we saw less bleaching as a result. And that's because, all of those weaker corals have been weeded out. So, and in moving forward, we are looking to reefs that have, more of those species as the ones to perhaps focus on for protection too. But we lose a lot of function with the weaker corals that are being lost. And so while we may be able to maintain reefs into the future, with some of these better scenarios that Gareth illustrated, the species composition is still not going to be what it was, and we're going to have to learn how to manage these reefs in a different way and understand what functions they can provide, and really, optimize those to adapt to this new future that we're going into.
Well, there's a question that follows on from that I'd like to put to both of you, Gareth first, which is that on these maps, in the high resolution models as well, there are locations that whatever you do, they are still red. The prognosis is that it's not going to be very long before these are bleaching every year. So what do you do with that information? If you're someone who's living in one of those areas or managing that, and there's just this red, and it doesn't matter what we do in the future, it's still red. What happens next for those people?
Well, yeah, that's a great question. I'll re-emphasize the point that we're only modeling the exposure component here of that temperature stress. We don't know for sure how those reefs will respond to that temperature stress. From all the stuff we know that David's been talking about, obviously very high temperatures will likely mean very bad things for those places in terms of the coral cover and coral survival into the future. What it highlights to me is that those people urgently, need our attention, the world's attention, really. And you hear people talking about the language of sort of climate winners and climate losers, and I really don't like that. I think it's, imagine being told that you live on a climate loser reef. It's a very insensitive way, I think, to talk about all of this. And I think, what we need to do at this point is to help support those populations of people who rely on those resources, and that's the focus of those red areas for me. I don't think all is completely lost for those. I think there are some, if we are able to keep warming below the 1.5 degrees C, David will be hearing all about this week, I'm sure. We need to go well beyond some of the pledges that I've demonstrated in these maps today, I think. And so I don't think we should write those areas off, but I think they're focus areas for our attention in terms of helping to support social resilience.
And David, do you have anything to add to that from your experience in East Africa? When it's really not looking good in a local area, what happens?
Yes, well, no, I certainly thought about that a lot. And to be honest, with the scale of warming that we're seeing, it's really at regional levels. There are some local variations, as Gareth has shown in the maps, but there are countries, there are hundreds of kilometers of coastlines that are in those bad future, scenarios for coral reefs, no matter what happens with climate change. So we need to be managing for change. I think that's what climate change tells us. In some cases, we can, retain coral reefs of some form into the future. In others, we do need to realize that they're going to transition into something else, rocky reefs with algae and other invertebrates dominate on them. And the people living on those coastlines need them to be clean, functioning ecosystems. They'll be novel ecosystems, but they can still provide fish. They can still, support recreation and quality of life for resident communities. So the management is really about managing 100% of our coral reefs as they transition into a new future, not just focusing on the best ones that may survive into the future. And so really understanding that and working out how to address that, I think, is a big challenge for countries and NGOs, the scientific community, to really work out how to do that.
So it extends on that point of life will find a way, and we have to steward whatever life it turns out to be.
Exactly.
Well, with all the hubbub in the background, I think this is a good time to ask this question for you, David, that you are, in the middle of COP26 there, and obviously there are many, many issues that are being discussed. They involve, social justice and trees and insects and oil and, loads and loads and loads of topics. And in the past, it's certainly true that a lot of ocean scientists have felt that the ocean just got left out. And yet people have started to talk about, there was this phrase, the blue COP came along. So how much attention are you seeing the ocean get at COP26?
Yeah, so of course I have a bit of a biased view because I'm in the ocean events and, listening to all the discussion around ocean. So it feels like it's high. But the thing is, there's apparently 10 to 15,000 people here, and it's quite strange after being locked away for 18 months in our little bubbles. But it's quite clear that we need to have very strong decision in support of oceans. I mean, there's a strong feeling that, and this is a bit of a low-hanging fruit for the UK presidency at the moment, because there really is a very strong ocean science community here. There's strong messaging around oceans and climate. And there's a need to separate the oceans as an independent mandate from the land. The ocean is 70% of the planet, and there's a lot of new issues that come in when you're thinking about oceans. So we really need to facilitate that, to move from the blue COP that we just had to the legacy of this COP into the future for a 1.5 degree future. And I think really strengthening that oceans climate message, oceans climate and biodiversity, is a critical thing that needs to happen here. And we don't have the final answer on that. We'll know at the end of next week.
Great, thank you. I'm sure a lot of people will be listening with, it's just waiting. I mean, in a way, the suspense is terrible. It's great that it's all happening. The suspense is terrible. And on that point, Gareth, just quickly, what do you see, as someone who's working kind of at the coalface of one of these issues, what do you see when it comes to how seriously this is being taken, this whole topic, coral reefs and ocean temperature, how seriously it's being taken by the non-ocean world, if you like?
I hope it's being taken seriously. I mean, I guess, we mustn't forget that the land and ocean, of course, are linked, and things that we do on land affect the ocean as well. And so for too long, in some ways, I think the ocean management and land management have been siloed and managed separately. And in particular in Hawaii, working with Kim, I mean, folks in Hawaii have understood for a long time that what you do on land affects the ocean. So, I hope that really what happens here is that people start to go back to some of that traditional knowledge and start realizing that managing both can improve both, as well as the welfare of people. And I guess that's what I hope comes out of this.
It does feel as though a much more holistic view of the world is coming. So Heather Coldway has posted in the chat a link to the report that Gareth mentioned earlier. So do have a look at that if you'd like to follow up on that. We are approaching the end of our time here. So thank you to everyone that had questions. It's a massive topic to discuss, but hopefully that's given you a flavour of what's available. Do go and look at these maps, do get in contact with the people we've heard from to ask, because this is all a big collaborative effort. So just before we finish, we've got 2 important reminders for you. The first one you can see here is that the Bertarelli Foundation are supporting loads of great ocean projects like this one. And if you'd like to keep up to date on those and any future events, do follow @marine_science on Twitter, or have a look at the website marine.science if you're not a Twitter person, and you can see those on the screen here. And then next reminder, we have had a whole year now, almost a whole year, of the Ocean Matters podcast. And we have had some amazing interviews this year on topics like manta rays, ocean islands, plankton, poaching, sharks, seabirds, and lots of other things. But the most recent episode, just out yesterday, is about the links between ocean and climate. And we really do have some amazing interviewees for this one. People who've got a really deep insight into not just the issues now, but the history of how we got here. So it's well worth a listen. So go and find that by searching for the Ocean Matters podcast, and all the past episodes are available and will continue to be available there. So finally, I would like to thank everyone who's attended this online event for your attention and your participation. And of course, we owe a huge virtual round of applause for our 2 speakers live here today, Gareth and David, and the others who contributed to the video. I hope we're sending you off into the rest of your day. This is for the audience, feeling educated and motivated. And thank you once again for joining us.
Thanks very much.
Thank you all.